Hey folks, welcome to Insights in Action, where some of the world's best startup operators share moments of real insight and real impact. I'm your host, Bobby Pinero, and in today's episode, we've got a fantastic guest. He's a former operator turned VC. His name's Mike Duboe. Mike is currently a partner at Greylock Ventures and was previously the head of growth at Stitch Fix, an online personal styling service that is now publicly traded. In this conversation, Mike and I get into one of their most critical insights at Stitch Fix, how they defined a successful fix, and the growth that it unlocked for them. It was a super fun conversation with many applications for anyone interested in the intersection of growth and analytics. Let's jump in. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for being here today. Maybe give me a little bit of a teaser of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I thought today we could talk about the importance of intermediate metrics and/or pairing metrics in the context of organizational alignment. I think specific to growth here, the dangers of goaling teams separately on acquisition versus retention is something I could speak to, and the trade-offs in doing so, which is basically the ease of controlling or measuring versus the alignment with the business's North Star. So that was the topic I thought we could dig into.
Awesome. And maybe tell us a little bit about kind of why you're the person to talk through this and a little bit about your background here.
Yeah, sure. So my background, I'm currently a partner at Greylock, where I work across a number of companies and commerce marketplaces, et cetera. But prior to that, I was in charge of growth at several earlier companies. So was in charge of growth at Stitch Fix, which was more of a successful story, and then also ran growth at Tilt, which was an unsuccessful story, where we also had a more complex growth model. And so, at Tilt, I oversaw analytics and our data function as well. Whereas my job at Stitch Fix was basically running our marketing budget. And so kind of come at this growth problem from two different points of view.
Awesome. So let's talk intermediary metrics. Maybe tell me a little bit about how you actually, maybe a story of one that you implemented and what kind of impact it had on the business.
Yeah, so I'll go into a little bit of background on Stitch Fix and kind of the company's history prior to my joining and kind of what we were wrestling with kind of during my time there. And so the background on Stitch Fix, we grew Stitch Fix, by the way, for those who are not aware, is a personal styling service. In the early days, we were pretty early to kind of the subscription box trend of, shipping clothes. Client chooses what they want to keep in return, send back. But we very early invested in like a data science function. One of our key early hires was the head of data from Netflix, who was on the executive team for the basically duration of Stitch Fix. And so we had, the idea that there are all these individual kind of touch points on both on clients and their style preferences, as well as on, a piece of clothing. And there was just an opportunity to create like a matching algorithm, which was basically our core product in a similar way to like Netflix's, matching algorithm, right? And so that was always like the North Star for the company, which meant that because our core product was a styling algorithm, we were basically a very retention-focused business for a while. And Katrina, famously did not have the easiest time raising venture money, and at a certain point just really wanted to control her destiny as a company. So the company was also running under the constraint of profitability, prior to my time. And we were holding inventory. And so getting that, demand right, the demand supply match right with precision was very, very important. And so that's a point of context. For a while, we just had such strong pull for the product. Product market fit was really strong. And so controlling user acquisition was never a concern. And frankly, we didn't want to be dialing up demand prior to 2016, because we would have been dealing with long wait times if people, if we had an influx of demand. So that all started to change, just prior to my joining. And so I was hired to kind of build out a user acquisition function for the first time. We previously hadn't really spent much on advertising, and it was all organic. We did a little bit of influencer marketing, but that was kind of the history. So what I said about kind of rigor around just data science in general at the company, that trickled into basically every function. And so when I was kind of hiring to build out user acquisition function, there's the core, like, let's figure out what kind of attribution model and measurement we're using. Let's kind of get the team of channel managers in place who could actually run, Facebook, Google, TV kind of ads, the usual suspects with with some efficacy, and then start to do fancier stuff around like measurement. But, one of the things that we were always, we had a strong point of view on from the early days was like the precision on getting to paybacks versus optimizing for acquisition costs. We always like had a long-term view, because we were essentially a subscription service. Like, you want to optimize for clients who are going to stick around and not be short-sighted on first transaction, because actually we don't actually know the value of that first transaction until a ways out. And so that required us to build these, we call them PLTV or predictive LTV models, which basically, there were a bunch of attributes that someone gave us in the upfront style profile, and also feedback that they gave us over time on their fixes that could predict like someone's likelihood to stick around and spend money. And so the big realization here, and this gets to the point on intermediate metrics, was, the downstream quality or LTV of a client was really a function of who we acquired. And in some ways, we were able to serve, who we're able to serve best at any given point in time is dynamic. That's kind of an advanced topic that's for another day, because like we should be able to match like merch on hand with who we actually are bringing in. But when you shift to a payback oriented view of the world, you realize that retention is a more important driver than acquisition cost. But structuring a team to just focus on retention is kind of unfair. And that was how things were structured when I got there. So, an acquisition team can send a bunch of shitty quality signups through. And also, secondarily for a retention team, the levers oftentimes aren't really in their control. So outside of, CRM marketing channels, sending emails or lifecycle notifications, it's really a function of like what close we send someone that determines how retained they're going to be. So essentially, we wanted to goal our acquisition team on down funnel retention. The key trade-off here was, time to complete the feedback loop. Our funnel, just for some context, was we acquire someone, they hit the site, then they sign up, they complete the style profile, which basically helps determine what's going to be in your first fix. Then you order your first fix after that profile. And then, several weeks later, you check out with that fix, provide some feedback, tell us what you're keeping. And then you're on some cadence from there on out and when your next ones are going to come. So, the easiest data to send back to our ad channels was to just say, hey, first fix order, that's the conversion event, just go optimize for that. Actually, in the early days, it was signups, then we had enough volume where we can move it to fixes. But, we thought that moving it further down funnel was going to actually help better optimize for quality. And so we defined this new metric called successful first fix, where it was basically a new conversion event where a client had to meet two criteria. One, they kept at least one item. And two, they told us it was a binary question. Are you anticipating your next fix? And that was generally predictive of someone's likelihood to stick around. And the acquisition team didn't want any credit for acquisitions that didn't meet that criteria. And so, CAC ultimately goes up in that view of the world, but ideally overall revenue and kind of LTV goes up as well. So that's the long answer to a simple question, but that's probably the best example from Stitch Fix.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then I'm curious to understand the process by which you all came up with that or agreed on that metric. So one of the things that I can imagine, right, as a acquisition team, that's that's maybe a more high bar than most acquisition teams are used to being held to. And then at the same time, I can imagine a retention team, wanting you all to be held to a higher bar or, a higher bar than kind of, you might want. So what was the process of actually kind of determining that intermediary metric? How involved were you? How involved was the retention team? Who else was involved in that process?
Yeah, I mean, organizationally, it really helped that our head of retention at the time was we were attached to the hip in many ways. Like she was very close, and they were separate groups. But it would have been different if we weren't living like right next to one another. I think the key alignment here, I mean, what I said up front about data science, like that was a layer in the company that really was like kind of underpinning basically every function from like merchandise, like what we should be buying, to marketing, to how we staff our styling teams and building stylist portals. And so that was really the key alignment. And actually they were, as far as determining what that metric should be and how we define it, and actually what's predictive of retention and kind of building those PLTV models, like that was largely them. And so, that was pretty important. I think the other thing too is, you need to realize, like, as a leader, as an executive in a company, like ideally, whatever your goal on shouldn't be too far from like what the business actually cares about. And for us, like, revenue and profit, we were just 1 degree removed from that. I think once you start getting to like 2 or more, that's where you could have different organizational funkiness and politics and whatever. But I think, I would like to think we were at least business minded enough where we realized that, yes, there were going to be some trade-offs as far as like, immediate, like, hey, if we're just gold on CAC, like, and channel managers are too, and they're kind of, working all day to pull the levers and try to bring CAC down, like, that could be, that can be demotivating. It could be tempting to kind of try to game that. But actually, the design here was actually designed to prevent gaming, right? And gaming is not always intentional, right? It can just be like, if you're over optimizing for one metric without anything pairing or anything to keep that in control, like you are going to find the path of least resistance to actually move that number. And turns out Facebook like makes it quite easy like to do that as just a very efficient performance marketing channel. So yeah, I mean, I think sharing that context, over communicating, making it very clear with metric design, like how things cascaded like from the top level was really key. And the other thing I would just say on all this, like, I mentioned earlier, like the importance of actually being able to attribute like an outcome to an action that you take. Like we actually stopped using LTV eventually because like lifetime for us is very difficult. We had clients that were sticking around for 5, 6, 7 years. We had a bunch of data by the time I joined. And so really kind of we set a line in the sand of saying like 12-month contribution margin was kind of going to be what we measured and how we looked at payback, and which was actually like probably a little bit conservative, but that was our kind of proxy for LTV. So yep.
Got it. Awesome. I mean, a lot of things that you touched on there resonate with me. I mean, I think that it's a great role for a data science and an analytics team to play, to kind of be the, intermediaries or the unbiased kind of party that bring two folks together and kind of create that intermediary metric. And then I love your point around acting as a business owner and acting in kind of the best interest of, ultimately the business, as opposed to, your particular function or your particular, remit. I'm curious how this intermediary metric, this initial successful fix, how did it change your actions? How, like, were there certain campaigns that you turned on, influenced more? Were there certain campaigns that you then turned off? How did it actually influence your implementation?
Yeah, I'll give the most extreme example. This one's pretty, like, I guess commonly understood in the marketing world now. But like if you're looking at your entire channel mix, it's actually, to take a step back, like in our board decks, we were like not presenting on we were presenting payback at a channel level, and sometimes even at like an audience level, actually, like looking at the incremental CPA, and incrementality testing has been another topic. We try to use that as our main measurement method versus just kind of some simplistic like last touch attribution model. But we looked at everything on that channel level, kind of like payback. And so the most extreme example, or like outlier that would this kind of method would cause you to deprioritize, like affiliate marketing, right? And so like if we looked at affiliate as a channel, that was always going to be lowest CPA, lowest CAC. The problem with that, of course, like take I don't know, like honey or something like that, for example. And by the way, it's very business specific, right? So, but at Stitch Fix, we were always very deliberate on not like discounting, and for a variety of reasons. I think that even though CAC would have been lower and my job would have been easier in some ways, if we were able to hand out like seasonal promos, we knew that it would catch up to us in downstream quality. And like affiliate was like a pretty key example there. Like a lot of kind of clients that were hunting on affiliate or discount code sites, like ended up being lower quality. And they were just optimizing for like kind of a near term, like, deal where maybe they were going to keep an item or even zero and kind of just like churn out. And so the data was pretty clear when you looked at like aggregate kind of margin and like retention of clients on that channel versus like upstream acquisition. You look at it differently. It doesn't mean that you should turn the channel off altogether, but it changes your allocation there, and also like your understanding of it. The other thing I would say is, I mean, there were different, like a common example is like looking at search, right? And so there are certain keywords where are going to be like more expensive. Say people bidding on, when we launched our Luxe line, you start bidding on like different brand names or different items of clothing, and those are going to be more expensive keywords because you have, I don't know, like higher end brands kind of who are bidding on them. But those people tend to be, when you're going through the style profile, what they like, one of the questions is like what you like to spend in different categories, like that number was certainly going to be higher for some of those keywords. And so when you have enough time to actually see how that data plays out, it just causes you to make more kind of robust decisions on maybe having a higher tolerance for what you pay up front. So
Awesome. And then, do you remember how it was that you all got to, I think there was one question that you asked you asked, are you anticipating your first success, anticipating purchasing another fix?
Yep.
How did you all, like, that's pretty creative to then just like very explicitly ask a customer. I mean, a lot of SaaS businesses, I imagine, actually that could be a pretty cool idea. Like, do you anticipate renewing through your next billing? How did you all come up with that as a test?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the shorter answer there is that we had a team of, I think it was three basically PM kind of analysts who were, their entire job was working on the kind of style profile and like checkout flow. It was called the better data team at a time. And so like we, adding and removing questions from the style profile to get more precision on what we send someone. Like there were constantly experiments being run on that. So really like honestly, there was probably a little bit too much process to like add or remove stuff there, but for good reason. I think in this case, it was just an experiment where we had enough data to tell like that was actually predictive of someone's likelihood to be retained. It wasn't a decision we can make like that quickly, but you start to build more confidence in it over time. Sorry, it's not a super direct answer, but that's kind of the context. So
no, I love it. I mean, I think it's super interesting. Like I said, I think it might be applicable to. I'd be curious to see how often it would work for other SaaS businesses.
Yeah. Well, what's the question? Like Rahul at Superhuman, their product market fit question. It's like how it's similar to that. Like how upset would you be if this product were taken away? I think, or
right.
Measuring the level of indispensability of it. I think there's kind of a related thought there.
Yeah, I love that. And then I'm curious, how would you define an intermediary metric?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about this before, like, because we might be conflating it with like pairing metrics is another concept that I think is more widely understood now. And like, the general principle is more widely understood. I think going through the exercise of kind of understanding effect and counter effect can be illuminating. And so I think that like, when it comes to KPI design, like that's always something I've tried to like, introduce when we're going through either OKRs or just, cascading KPI design as a team. I think in this case with intermediary metrics, yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I think of it a lot in the context of like org design, and you want to make sure like, if you have one team kind of, blowing out their goals while the other's lacking, or if you have the North Star of the business moving in one direction, where specific teams are moving in the other direction, and it's just unclear that what they're doing is actually moving things in the right way. If you have cross like teams kind of like arguing with one another, and it feels counterproductive, like that's probably a sign that you should rethink metric design. So, as far as intermediary, like it's more when you think of it in a traditional like funnel oriented view of the world, which is maybe more applicable to e-commerce. Now this concept of loops versus funnels is more widely understood, but with e-commerce, a lot of the time it is funnel oriented. Like that's where I think getting to the next level of granularity on kind of understanding those compromises, like in this case, it makes sense. I think I have a harder time articulating this in like, companies like that are more, social, like, social networks or frankly, other network oriented businesses. It's probably a little bit different, but that's, maybe a little bit more context on it.
And are there any examples of like commonly, I mean, it sounds like just common kind of intermediary or intermediary metrics or kind of breakpoints in organizations that you see there is a necessity to have something like this, a handoff like this. So obviously between user acquisition, retention, that might be one example. Sales and marketing, like MQLs, things like that might be another example. Yeah. Any others that come to mind that, folks should be thinking about implementing?
That's a really good one. I mean, one example that I talk about sometimes is like with referrals. Like a lot of businesses who have the potential to be strongly referral driven, like Airbnb or Dropbox are like kind of commonly understood examples right now. But like those companies built, like, I think Airbnb had like 2 dedicated product teams just around referrals. And like if you double click on it, is its own kind of funnel. So if you break it up into its like 3 subcomponents, which is basically like number of referrers, spread, so like number of referrals per referrer, and then conversion, like your likelihood to convert from a received kind of invite, like those 3 like buckets should have different experiment roadmaps under each of those, and probably different objective. I mean, the objective function is clear, it's kind of what I just said, but like each of those should be its own thing. And if you're just looking at referrals kind of overall in aggregate and just looking at that number to move it, you probably are not able to move it as well as if you break it down to that next level. So this is maybe what I'm talking about is a cousin of like this like intermediary metric thing that we're talking about. But I do think like the principle is still the same of actually getting down to a level of granularity where teams actually have the ability to move that. And that needle moving is very much aligned with the North Star that you care about. In this case, growth coming from referrals.
Right. It's aligned. The thing that's most important is that the incentives of whoever is doing the kind of upfront moving is aligned to the overall incentives of the company. Yeah. Some of the others that like one other that came to mind for me was, a lot of sales teams, for example, have like a hunter farmer model, and there's always like what's the right handoff between the person who's selling the deal and the person who's then responsible for retaining the deal. Yeah. And I've seen successful implementations of, I guess, what we call in this case implementation or intermediary metrics when there's a handoff between somebody who initially sold the deal and somebody who's then responsible for upselling or retaining it.
Yeah, it's a great example. Yeah.
Cool. And then any kind of framework or generalized principles that you can think about as organizations start to think about implementing or designing intermediary metrics?
Yeah, well, I guess there's two things I would say here, and one of these is going to sound a little bit kind of trite, but like the importance of building a growth model up front. Like I think a lot of founders who I come across, like they either operate with the traditional kind of funnel framework, which you've talked about, or just like assume like, hey, the P&L is like your company's model. In reality, like probably the most important thing one could do early, and I say this like if someone's hiring a head of growth, like if this isn't in place, then that needs to be your first job, is kind of understanding the different levers at play and the relative importance, and actually have that down in a simple spreadsheet to understand like how your business actually grows. And it's, like I said, in an e-commerce business, it's probably going to be a little bit more straightforward if you're kind of a transactional selling, some products D2C. But for many others, interesting businesses, marketplaces, other networks, like, it's a step more complex and like custom. And so just investing in actually like understanding that growth model up front is important. The second point, like with regards to metric design on an org, I think there's like it's not really a framework, but like a few points I think that are helpful. So one, I think it's important for the metrics to cascade. So from top level company to execs to teams and individuals, like we talked about the importance of individuals being able to actually like control and translate their input into some kind of movement on a metric that actually matters. But I think in general, you should be able to actually look at, on a diagram, like it cascading down from like the company's North Star down to every individual and or every individual team, I should say. But like if that's not happening, then that's problematic. The second is like there should be some regular rhythm in reviewing them and actually space to incorporate qualitative feedback. This was actually really important in a company like Stitch Fix that was so data oriented and so kind of algorithmic and everything we did, which I think can actually be overkill sometimes. Like at Stitch Fix, we had probably the most critical model we had in this company was this demand forecasting model, which predicted how much we should buy. It was actually like a media mix model for marketing efficacy. It was feeding into our financial projections. And so we had every Tuesday, we had all the leaders that were kind of, impacting this model in some way. It got together and we did like model adjustment hour where we kind of refitted it every week, but they incorporated qualitative feedback, which you wouldn't be able to tell like from, just from the metrics it was ingesting from marketing spend and things like that. So it could be like, hey, we actually had like some outage on this channel for a period of time, or our TV buys like ended up kind of like going awry, or whatever. So like there's no use setting a metric that people can't see move, and so having a feedback loop that people are actually able to see, but also like give input to, I think is important. And then I think finally, like you have to stick with them for enough time. Like I think I've seen a lot of thrash in companies when goalposts move too frequently. And it's tempting as a founder, like to do this a lot, especially when you see a better version. And you have a strong hypothesis that that's a better version. It's okay for your North Star to evolve, and actually it's probably a flag if it's not. But I think there's a cost to these changes, and you have to realize that. And if it's changing more than, I don't know, every 6 months, if it's that early, like I've just seen that be like problematic. So.
Awesome. Super helpful. Well, thanks, Mike. I really, really appreciate you taking the time today. And this was really fun.